Hi everybody, my name is Matthew Poes and this is Poes Acoustics. So today I'm going to talk about I'm going to call it three things, top three things to improve your home theater's performance, but I want to be clear that each of these actually breaks out into deeper topics, and so arguably there's more than three things we're really getting at here. So the first one is really about optimizing positions, and you've got speaker positions and you've got U positions, the seating positions. So let's start with speakers. The whole concept behind a surround system is that the speakers are supposed to be laid out around you in such a way that ideally they are close to equal distance from the primary seating position. If you're in your seat, the center should be straight ahead of you, should not be off to one side or the other. The left and the right should be equal distance from the center, from each other to you, which means that everything is symmetric. The surround should be the same way. Now, of course, we all have realities we have to deal with, and you may have to move your surrounds around. You want to get those left, right, and center speakers as perfect as possible relative to your seating position. You should be centering the system around the primary seating position. So that's an important one. Now, let's just say for the sake of argument that you have a system where that's not possible in part because you have two primary seats. So I've seen systems where, for example, the husband and the wife basically say they want this set up so that it is as equally good for both of them. What that means is we're going to compromise a little for each of them by making the correct primary seat the armrest between them. It may not actually be an armrest, it might be a couch or something, but the point is it's going to be that point between them where nobody sits. They're a little bit off to the side, but it does minimize the error, but you're optimizing the speaker locations. Okay, then you've got the seating locations relative to the speakers. So again, I understand there's going to be always some realities we have to deal with seat positions, but for the most part, you want to have the seats the correct distance from all of the boundaries in the room, the walls, the right distance to the speakers for optimal sound. So some of this depends a little bit on the speaker, but for the most part, most speakers will work well anywhere from around 2 meters or 6 feet-ish all the way back to 5 or 6 meters or 15 to 18 feet plus, 19 feet, I guess that gets closer to. Bigger speakers being farther back makes more sense. But the other part of the seat position optimization is the room itself. So the speakers and the listener position should be kind of in concert with each other. So if they're box speakers instead of an in-wall or baffle mount speaker, they typically are going to get pulled into the room a bit. And you're going to want those a good 1 or 2 meters from that front wall. You're going to want them a similar, probably at least 1, but ideally more like 2 meters from the side walls, maybe more in a bigger room. And then you're going to want your position to be at least the same distance that the speakers are apart. You're going to want to be back from them. There are some situations where it may be optimal, this is mostly a music thing and not so much a movie thing, to actually have the speakers even farther apart. But in many cases doing that can cause poor center image for 2-channel, and with multi-channel systems, the aperture between the left speaker and the center and the right is too great. And so you're really better off in those multi-channel systems if you want that really big image to acoustically treat the room correctly for that, but then also add wides. It's just a better way to go. So for the sake of argument, you're typically going to want it, like the Dolby standard, kind of be in that 25 to 30 degrees from center to left and center to right speaker. So for the sake of argument, somewhere in the neighborhood of 60, maybe as much as 70 degrees apart between the left and the right speakers. You're probably not going to want to get into that 100 degrees apart. It's a little bit too much, but to each their own. You want to optimize your seat position to get that all right, because in many cases the left and the right speaker position is somewhat fixed. There's certain things like keeping them far enough away from the walls, the screen size, everything else that kind of dictates that. So in many cases what that means is you're going to end up having to push your seat forward from the back wall. If it's too far back, the aperture angle is actually too small, and you've got other problems, which is the direct to reflected ratio ends up becoming way too low. You're getting way too many reflections that are, relatively speaking, too early. A lot of them coming from behind you. Yeah, you can treat it, but treatment is never the better option than better placement. So that chair really ideally should be a little forward of center or a little back of center of the room. If it's a really large room, you could go back even farther and be 2/3 back in the room or so and end up with pretty good sound. But that would be a pretty large room again to make that work. What you'd never want to do is place the speaker, or the listener, I should say, right up against the wall. That's the worst place. And if you're doing that and you're having sound quality problems, I understand that there are a lot of rooms where placing the couch against the wall is the only option, but you got to understand that's a bad location. It's going to create a lot of acoustic problems, and that very well may be the issue. And there are even certain speakers that will really exacerbate how bad that is. And I've run into it with a few folks. The Poke L800s was one of them. Because of the way that that does crosstalk cancellation, the effective reflections off that back wall are so significant that they totally disrupt it. So people were buying these speakers, placing the speakers up against the wall, but then placing themselves up against a wall too, and then wondering why they weren't getting that really good magical imaging that they heard in the store when they got demos. The answer is easy. It's the back wall. And in some cases, folks would actually treat that and find that it's all better. It fixed the problem. Well, reality is that same problem that you're getting there that was so easy to hear because of the crosstalk cancellation, it's always there. Anytime you're sticking yourself up against the wall like that, it's there. It's just not quite as obvious until you can figure out a way to get rid of it, like moving your chair up. So if you can design your room so that the couch is a good, at least 2 or 3 meters off the back wall, that's really ideal. And I would say generally farther the better. All right, so that's speaker locations. As I said, optimizing the position of the person. Again, with home theaters, it's not just speaker to person that matters. The listening positions also actually affect viewing. And so screen size, often we have a certain screen size we've picked or we can deal with. Projectors, especially the lesser expensive ones, I mean, really anything under about $10,000 or $15,000, typically can't light up really huge screens. So we're probably, in my experience at least, limited to about 150 inches before the screen gets too dim. I know there's people doing even bigger. Even 150 inches is pushing it with a lot of projectors, where with an HDR image, we're just not going to be able to get those highlights to be bright enough to really give you that HDR effect. So in my opinion, especially since you really should be using a acoustically transparent screen for best sound, you really should be sticking to an appropriately sized screen that gets you the right viewing angle, that also can be lit up to a proper brightness. I don't know that that 16 lumen standard that you sometimes hear for movies, which was it's a really old standard, really makes sense in the modern HDR world. I really think that we're talking about needing to be able to have I mean, yes, the average brightness probably still needs to be between, let's say, 16 and 20, maybe 25 lumens, but I think that the projector still has to be able to light up those highlights to something that's many, many, many times that, and it's not going to be able to do that. So, so you really want to make sure that your viewing position is right, that the field of view you get from your screen is optimal, and by pushing your seat closer to the screen, you can go with a smaller screen, light it up brighter, and get a better overall picture. So that's the positioning. Then you've got acoustic treatment. So I've covered this before. I'll probably cover it again and again and again because it's one of the things that I'm most passionate about with this topic, but it really is one of the most basic things you can do to improve the quality of your home theater. Just spend some time doing some acoustic treatment. And if you don't want to go and put a lot of acoustic treatments up on the walls, do something. Like, just get something up there. Something is generally going to be better than nothing. So putting some curtains up in the room, adding some extra pillows, adding a 1/2 inch, ideally at least 1/2 inch felt pad under any rugs that are in the room, unless it's just a regular wall-to-wall carpeting, in which case the carpet's probably fine as is. All of that makes a pretty big difference, and it's worth doing. Then we've got calibration. So there's 2 main areas of calibration that really matter. You've got the system sound calibration, the receiver, for instance, or processor. So you've got speaker levels, speaker distance, you've got the subwoofer to speakers integration, which is the crossover point, but also the phase of the subwoofer so that they're time aligned correctly. Actually, distance is part of that too. And then you've also got EQ, which may be auto EQ, maybe manual EQ. For a lot of folks, this is so over their head that They do nothing at all. And then they wonder why it doesn't sound good. And I've actually had quite a few people come to me and say, I'd like your services to help me optimize the system. And I get in there and I've just learned to say to people, look, we may not be spending a lot of time EQing. We may actually be spending a lot of time optimizing other aspects of it. Sometimes the biggest improvements in the frequency response, which ultimately lead to the biggest improvements in sound quality, actually come from fixing the subwoofer to main speakers integration. So just spending extra time making sure that the distance that the subwoofer is set is right to get really good phase alignment and time alignment between the subwoofer and the mains ends up yielding better results. There are certain things on the market that people utilize, or just it happens that the way the system kind of auto-calibrates itself, that the subwoofer ends up being phase aligned relatively well, but not nearly time aligned, and it's off by many cycles. So that transition point at around 80 hertz ends up having the subwoofer lagging the main speakers by 1, 2, I've even seen as much as 10 cycles. For those who are wondering what the scenario was, I've seen the 10 cycles a couple times, and it's a mini DSP. So a mini DSP is going to introduce about 20 to 30 milliseconds of latency on its own, which is going to cause that problem right off the bat. That's going to end up being a couple of cycles at the crossover point on its own. When you add in a bunch of crossover filters, EQ, etc., it further exacerbates that. Because it adds group delay. So the group delay acts similar to the latency. All of that leads to the woofer being behind the main speakers, basically, and from a timeline standpoint. And so what happened in the worst case scenario was that at around 60 or 70 hertz, the subwoofer was 100 milliseconds. And at the same crossover point, the speakers themselves were at around 10 milliseconds. And so they were off by 90 milliseconds, which is pretty close to 10 cycles. 10 cycles would be 100 hertz, so I guess it's not quite that much at 60 hertz, but that was around the crossover point. And there was just this big area between, I'd say 60 and 100 hertz, where you could see the time, kind of we'll call it the peak time curve, was coming way out. And we just spent a bunch of time making adjustments in the receiver to compensate for the mini DSP, actually taking and turning off some of the DSP that had been done. It was unnecessary. It was making it flatter, but it wasn't audible stuff. And it was adding extra delay, and then re-optimizing it. And in the end, it measured way better and it sounded way better. So that ends up being a pretty important thing to do. And if this is all over your head, the point is there are people out there that can help you that ultimately can make the system sound a lot better. So then the other thing you want to do is spend some time with video calibration. So sound calibration is really important, yes, but very few displays, even projectors, are perfect out of the box. And even if they were, especially projectors, the projector would be perfect on the screen it was calibrated on. It won't necessarily be perfect on your screen. And so depending on the screen you have and how good it is, it could be throwing things off. So ultimately there's some video calibration, and there's actually test discs that have a lot of the test patterns on them and they show you what to do to optimize it. It's not as good as having a professional calibrate it, which can be expensive, but it can get you closer. And so I would say for the average person, picking up one of the discs like the Spears and Munsell disc, which I think are like $50, $60, and then using that to calibrate the video really can go a long way towards improving the overall experience that you have. I had actually so when I first got my JVC projector, which they do come actually well calibrated out of the box, but they're not perfect. What I had found was that in particular, because I was using a spandex screen, which has really good sound quality, but it's very dim, it doesn't reflect light all that well. And so because of that, one of the problems I had was HDR content just looked awful. I mean, it was so bad. The blacks were actually, in order to make everything else look good, the blacks were being compromised. If I made the blacks look good, everything else was compromised to the point that the image was too hard to see. And so ultimately, I never found HDR content to really look nearly as good as standard we'll call it non-HDR content through that projector, even though like the colors, for instance, with HDR content were beautiful. So all of the 4K discs, the wider color gamut was coming through on that projector really well, but the dynamic range was crushed so badly that it just didn't look good. So having a professional come in and properly calibrate that actually made a big difference, because I didn't really know what I was doing, and at the time didn't have those test discs to get in and do it right. I've since learned, of course, a lot more about that and I'm better with that. But you know, it was worth it for me to have somebody who better understood video calibration. Sound's really my thing more than video. to come in and do that. But as I said, now there's test discs that can be helpful. Not as good as a professional, but they can be helpful at fixing these issues. And so really spending the time to calibrate everything, I think, is worth it. So those would be my 3 main tips. As I said, you could really pull all those out even further. And we could delve into other aspects of them. There's other things I didn't get into with home theaters that are good for improving it. The color scheme in the room. You know, if you have an all-white room or a very light room, probably not ideal. You could do some things to change the color of the room to improve it. Worse yet, I see this actually fairly common, a red room. Like green and red are probably the 2 most awful colors you could possibly paint a theater. It affects actually the color balance on the screen. It tends to cast from the reflections back onto the screen a shifted color that affects the color accuracy. There's a psychological effect of those 2 particular colors that negatively affect our experience in the theater, and so they're just not good. And yet, because they're colors that are fairly popular, you do see them in home theaters quite a bit. So you need to be very careful what stuff is around the screen and things like that. But those are kind of advanced optimization issues. I think for the average person, spending time to really optimize the speaker location and the listener position, acoustically treating the room to some level, like I said, even putting curtains up can make a pretty big difference. And then taking the time to calibrate both the audio and the video can really help to improve the experience you get. And honestly, doing those 3 things could end up saving you spending money on new equipment you don't need. So I really also have people come to me quite often who want to buy new equipment to fix a problem. And it's like, on one hand, yeah, I'd love to sell you something because I'll make a little money on it and that's how I make a living. On the other hand, I don't want people wasting money unnecessarily, and I don't think that's right. And so I'll usually spend some time to talk to them and find out what's wrong. And if it seems pretty clear that what's going on isn't an equipment problem, but it's actually a setup problem, then we kind of go that direction, because ultimately I really think that's the better use of money and time than new equipment. I mean, new equipment's fun, but you know, if things don't sound right and you upgrade the speakers, but they didn't sound right because of acoustics or because of acoustics and placement, and let's just say even worse, and acoustic optimization, like there was no calibration done, well, then the new speakers aren't going to fix that. Everything's still going to sound bad. And until you address that problem, it's going to always be bad. So you really want to make sure you get those things right before you start investing in new equipment. So I hope this was helpful. These are my 3 tips. And like I said, I got more videos coming. So thanks again for watching. Oh, and please follow, because that helps me to grow my channel.